Hi YouTubers, this is Tamara again. Welcome to 2020. This is my second YouTube video, and it is in fact not going to be part two of the last one. I started the last video. It was self-determination. I started it on the second day of Kwanzaa, which was the 27th of December. And the next day I started part two, but right while I was in the middle of recording, my son called, and so the phone rang. I'm not set up for video editing or anything like that, so the phone ringing was in the recording, and me answering the phone was in the recording, and then I stopped, and because I really was not set up to edit the video, I simply deleted that. And then I never got back to it. So I will get back to part two. There were some things I wanted to pick up on, but today I'm just taking a moment to do a different topic and just something that's top of mind for me. And that topic is on the topic of reparations. And so when I think about that, I just want to say that as is probably true across a lot of topics, my perspective on this is one that has shifted over the years, and also has, I think, been informed by a lot of my journey. So as I think about my history with Black nationalist thought, my history having grown up in the church, my history of now being a Baha'i, when I think about it in those terms, I wind up thinking that I've come to a very different idea about reparations. And also I want to say that some of this is really not, it's not good. I guess I should say it like that. It's very cynical, I think, some of my opinions about reparations. But I think it's also realistic, and I think it's worth at least considering and putting forward in the realm of ideas. So I wanted to take a moment to do that, and so this video will be my second topic, and it's the second line of conversation that I'm opening. So we've had a debate, which was so exciting. I was so enthusiastic. I watched it. I recorded a lot of the debate on H.R. 40. And that conversation was just brilliant. I think many of us have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' long-form essay in The Atlantic on the case for reparations, which again was simply brilliant. And I think that there has been some conversation as to why one wouldn't do reparations. The question of who owes reparations, and the question of who gets reparations, right? So let me just take that side first. So the question of who gets reparations and the question of who owes reparations are both generational questions. So people who are, in our current generation, so many years forward from slavery, even so many years forward from Jim Crow, convict leasing and other situations like that, can feel like, well, I didn't have anything to do with that. Maybe that was my ancestors, but I don't owe that debt, and I don't want to be responsible for an apology on behalf of my ancestors, and B, I don't want to have a transference of wealth on behalf of my ancestors. Of course, that's a pretty short-sighted viewpoint. I think that we now know that wealth is in fact intergenerational, and it accumulates across generations. And so if our ancestors have ill-begotten gains, as it were, regardless of how our ancestors got their wealth, the next generation benefits. And so it's an interesting dynamic, because that intergenerational dynamic suggests that there's a great deal of benefit of let's say, robbing banks and getting away with it long enough to stash the money away and pass it on to the next generation. because your future generations will benefit because of the wealth that you're handing off to them, regardless of how you got it. So you can see just from that framework that there's a moral implication to the idea that we should ignore debts of our ancestors. And of course, if you've read the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece, you know that the debt of reparations is accumulative, not just because of the multi-generational wealth harm, but because racism and the way that it continually excluded African Americans from participating fully in the economic well-being of society is also multi-generational. It has taken on many different forms, many different ways in which African American labor has been systematically exploited, the ways in which that African Americans have been systematically excluded from participating in economic benefits sanctioned or encouraged by our government. And so I think that it's really an unfair argument, I think, to say, oh, well, that didn't have anything to do with my generation, because yes, it does. Even as recently as the 90s and the war on drugs and the persistent mass incarceration of African Americans, particularly disproportionately for the same crimes as white Americans, so-called white Americans, I want to put it that way. The disproportionate exploitation of labor and the disproportionate arrest records and the way that destabilizes the economic well-being of families in the African American community, and the way that prison labor is utilized to build wealth for multinational corporations, etc. You know, again, watch 13th. Ava DuVernay's documentary is brilliant in exploring the ways that the 13th Amendment has created this new way of generating wealth, largely through the exploitation of African Americans, or as they say in modern day, black and brown peoples who are disproportionately incarcerated. So no, actually, there's no generation of Americans who are actually completely exempt from reparations, but there is, at least because of the way that we talk about reparations, there's at least some idea that we maybe should, we maybe don't belong to that. And then from the standpoint of generations in America, as for African Americans, or as we've talked about in the last video, descendants of American slavery, well, a lot of people who are African Americans are not descendants of American slavery. A lot of people who arrived in these shores are, however, victims of racism in America, nevertheless having arrived ancestrally after American slavery. And so this idea of this intergeneration, which generation of brown-skinned people, which generation of African Americans get reparations, is actually more complex, I think, than the way that we sometimes talk about it. And this is another way in which I differ somewhat from the ADOS movement, which establishes strictly a lineage-based formulation. I think that lineage basis is fairly important. I think that there is a good reason to state that the majority of reparations ought to be to those who are direct descendants of American slavery, but not exclusively. You know, I think that if Amadou Diallo was shot up so many times when I was a young person in New York City, you know, he was shot up because he had black skin, and that's perpetuation of American racism. And, you know, who cares that he was not lineage of African Americans? Nobody stopped to ask that question when they shot him. So, yeah, we all participate. This is why I use this language, present as black in America. I present as a black woman in America. That's how people see me. I am African American by culture, and I am a descendant of American slavery. But, what people see on the surface is they see a black woman in America, and how I get treated, and what the outcomes are for me, just on looks alone, is not different than the outcomes for a sister of mine who may be from Jamaica. It's not different. And actually, because I grew up in Brooklyn, and because lots of people assume that I come from Jamaica. That's just an assumption people make. Like, oh, you look like a Jamaican. No, I'm born and raised in Brooklyn, but I get why you think that. Because we look alike in terms of being black people, and because, of course, I grew up in a part of New York City where West Indian heritage was pretty predominant. So, hey, and I like my well, it's not going to come to beef patties. I used to love beef patties. Now I don't eat beef, but back in the day, beef patties and cocoa bread, right? So, so this question of reparations is really, really intricate, and so I 100% support studying H.R. 40. And I have a resistance to the idea of financial reparations until we work this out, until we have some consensus on how to do this. I have an opinion about how we ought to do this. I think that there ought to be a matrix scale of, when did you jump into American slavery and start being impacted by it? When did your generation begin their sojourn in this nation, and that your reparations should be scaled accordingly. That's the basis of my idea. But at the same time, I'm deeply, deeply resistant to immediate financial reparations. And I come by that opinion because of a keen awareness, which had been very visceral, just a thing that in your bones, right? I know because I've grown up in America, because, these stories get passed down, not even as stories, but just as, anecdotal warnings about how you have to be so much better, how you have to always be watching yourself, how we have to stick together. These are proverbial ideas that get communicated across the African American experience. And what is that about? Well, there's an amazing book called White Rage. The author is Carol Anderson. If you've not read it, please do. I want to thank my pastor. He's my honorary pastor. I'm a Baha'i, so I don't have, Baha'is don't have clergy. But my husband is Christian, and I attend his church, and I'm an honorary member there. And my pastor there, his name is Pastor Hart, gave me this book loaned it to me, and I'm still holding it because it's so intense that it's hard to read. But it documents the ongoing, persistent pattern of black progress and white backlash. And it can be argued, it can be rather effectively argued, that the election of our 45th president is at least partly because of a backlash against the election of our 44th president. Is that the only factor? I doubt it. A candidate that I'm watching actively, Andrew Yang, makes a different case that the American people, generally speaking, want a change agent. And so that gets reflected in both the election of our 44th president and the 45th president. And in as much as things have not dramatically changed for anybody, he's betting on the idea that people still want a change agent and that he's got a shot because of it. And I think there's some valid truth to that. I really do. But I don't think that you can completely negate. As a matter of fact, it would be silly to completely neglect the presence of racism and white nationalists at Trump rallies when he was running. It would be folly to negate the fact that racism played a part or was some element in there, and that racism was not just racism as much as that it was a little bit of a backlash because we weren't supposed to have an African American president. That was not supposed to happen. And in the eyes of those who view the world through that kind of lens. I'm going to say that that's not the majority, but I am going to say that it's enough of a minority as to have very visceral, vicious, violent manifestation. And we saw it. So when I think about that, when I think about that pattern of black progress and white backlash, when I think about it in those senses, well, what I come to is I say, well, why would we want reparations when we know that that's the pattern? We know that if we got the reparations, this backlash is coming. Why don't we solve the problem of this pattern of backlash? Why don't we break the cycle? And I think that some people feel that that the cycle isn't breakable, that racism is so deeply entrenched in American society that there's nothing that can be done, that African Americans need to just retrench into their own separate pockets and be self-protective, get the money while the money is gettable, and do for ourselves. Maybe some of us, build businesses and so forth and so on, And so we have this idea, but the perspective of generations that's documented in this book of White Rage suggests that we've done that. We've done it. We have had, major, successful black economic progress. Look up Black Wall Street. That episode of history, Black Wall Street is a catchphrase at this point for numerous race riots that took place across the country in various cities, in various places where white racism arose against pockets of wonderful, amazing, productive black progress. And the uprising was violent, vicious, to where, where is Black Wall Street? I mean, it was burned to the ground. Where was the justice for those people? There was none. How did people survive that? Many didn't. So when I think about it, I say, well, no, I don't want this money. Maybe there wouldn't be race riots, maybe not. We're watching a wave of increased anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism. Why would we expect that there would not be violent, vicious racism in face of reparations being paid out? Or why do we think that given, the crack epidemic of the 80s, why would we think that money being poured out to the African American community in the form of reparations, that there would not be some new something that would wash over the community instantaneously to take back the wealth. And here's the most insidious part of it. And having taken back the wealth, having risen up and squashed people, because we are still a numerical minority in this country, having done so, what about, what do we say when, the payment for racism and slavery and all that has already been made? How do we make a moral argument? Forget moral. How do we make any argument that more needs to be done? Because, we got our money. We got paid. The damage has been repaired, allegedly. So I think that we have to think carefully about what is the damage and what needs to be repaired, and does money fix it? And my argument is no. Money does not fix anything until we have a structure in place that allows money to fix things. When the society is structured in such a way that we can benefit from wealth rather than, return it back to the society at large and be empty-handed through such mechanisms as drugs, alcohol, predatory lending. I just really don't trust the structure of society as it exists today. So what would I like to see? Well, I would like to see increased incorporation of our education across the entire country. Currently our educational system is, number one, financed by local property taxes, which means that poor people get fewer resources. I'd like to fix that because African Americans are disproportionately affected by that. I'd like to see some sort of mechanism whereby history is fully incorporated so that the contributions of all peoples in this country, and especially of African Americans, so that the understanding of what 13th, that we learn in 13th, and so that the understanding of what happened with white rage is communicated early. We don't want to find out about it as adults. We want to make sure that our children know about this and grow up with an understanding that this is an injustice that they have an opportunity to change as they become adults. We don't want to wait to educate our population. We don't want to teach people that the Civil War was a war for states' rights. No, the Civil War was a war about slavery. One side wanting to keep slavery, one side not wanting to do so. But mostly one side wanting to keep slavery. That was mainly the issue, and being willing to divide the nation over it. So no, this was not a states' rights issue. This was a slavery issue that this war was fought over. We need to teach that history. We need to teach, hey, you want to say Robert E. Lee was a hero? Okay, well, let's unpack that. In what way was he a hero? A hero to whom? What does it mean to celebrate his life and his legacy when he was a traitor to his country? Okay, so, yeah, I think that we ought to put those things first. We ought to put racial healing, truth and reconciliation, education first, so that we change the structures of our society. And then here again, I'm going to once again mention Mr. Andrew Yang as a candidate, because something that he's been talking about, again, I don't disagree with his analysis that our 45th president was elected because of Americans wanting change that would be meaningful to them. I don't disagree with that analysis. I think it's incomplete. But to the extent that it's true, I think that he is making an accurate assessment that it's really easy to scapegoat other peoples when we feel insecure. And so I really am excited and intrigued by Mr. Yang's proposal of a universal basic income. He calls it a freedom dividend. I'm intrigued by it because, yeah, to lay the foundation where we can start looking at each other as Americans, where we can start recognizing our combined heritage, where we can start teaching our combined heritage without this backlash, like, oh no, I don't want to learn history like that because that makes me angry or insecure or afraid. You know, I want to keep holding on to the white supremacist view of history. I want to keep believing in fictions that disadvantage minority populations. I like them, right? No, we need to tell a story that's one story and not multiple stories. We should not have a history that African Americans understand and a history that white Americans, so-called white people, understand. No, we should have American history that's shared, that gives us a foundation of understanding ourselves as one. But getting there, I think, might require releasing or undoing this sense of the term that Mr. Yang uses is scarcity mindset. That idea that if you get something, I must lose something. We have to undo that thinking so that we have a basis of understanding that we grow together. So when I think about reparations, those are some of my thoughts. And as a descendant of American slavery, again, I do think that descendants of American slavery absolutely need to be compensated financially for theft of labor, multi-generational theft of labor, and multi-generational exclusion from economic participation in very meaningful ways. But I think that that's not step one, is what I think. And I also think that other people who have arrived at these shores and present as black in America are part of the reparations equation because they are harmed by American racism. And maybe they don't get reparations back from slavery, but maybe they do get reparations from redlining, etc. Mass incarceration, you know? So that's my take. I'm interested in yours. And again, this is called Just Conversations, and that's my goal, is to open up conversations with me. We'll get back to Self-Determination Part 2 as soon as I've got time to do it. Have a great day. Okay, well, before I sign off and finish getting ready for my big date tonight, I have a big date with my husband, and that's exciting because when you're a working person and your husband is a working person, dates are kind of hard to come by. So I'm excited that we're going to go on a date, Anyway, before I get off the line, before I end this video, I want to take a minute to say a prayer for those who are in prison. And, you know, there are a lot of people who are in prison unjustly. There are a lot of people who are in prison because they did stuff that they ought not to have been doing. But we do know that African Americans, particularly African American men, but African Americans generally, are disproportionately incarcerated, often incarcerated for longer periods of time, with conditions set for recidivism. So we know that there's a way in which that the system is stacked against people who present as the world as black in America, and that they wind up in jail. And so knowing that, I want to take a moment to say this prayer. This is a Baha'i prayer. The founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, was himself unjustly imprisoned. And many of the early followers of the Baha'i faith, and as a matter of fact, in today's world, even the current day followers of the Baha'i faith in some parts of the world, particularly in the country of the birth of the faith, which is Iran, are unfairly incarcerated. So, so I want to say this prayer for all people who find themselves incarcerated, even if you've done something that got you in jail, you know. Even if that's the case, this prayer is for you, or for the families of those who if impacted that way. And certainly, even if you've been jailed justly because of a crime, but with the way the system is structured, your pathway out of that track of continual incarceration or repeat incarceration, or even your term of stay being excessive by comparison to others in the society. Whatever your circumstances, I want to offer this prayer. So, lauded be thy name, O my God. Thou beholdest me in the clutches of my oppressors. Every time I turn to my right, I hear the voice of lamentation of them that are dear to thee, whom the infidels have made captive for having believed in thee and in thy signs, and for having set their faces toward the horizon of thy grace and of thy loving kindness. And when I turn to my left, I hear the clamor of the wicked doers, who have disbelieved in thee and in thy signs, and persistently striven to put out the light of thy lamp, which sheddeth the radiance of thine own self over all that are in thy heaven and all that are on thy earth. The hearts of thy chosen ones, O my Lord, have melted because of their separation from thee, and the souls of thy loved ones are burnt up by the fire of their yearning after thee in thy days. I implore thee, O thou maker of the heavens and Lord of all names, by thy most effulgent self, and thy most exalted and all glorious remembrance, to send down upon thy loved ones that which will draw them nearer unto thee, and enable them to hearken unto thine utterances. Tear asunder with the hand of thy transcendent power, O my Lord, the veils of vain imaginings, that they who are wholly devoted to thee may see thee seated on the throne of thy majesty, and the eyes of such as adore thy unity may rejoice at the splendors of the glory of thy face. The doors of hope have been shut against the hearts of that long for thee, O my Lord. Their keys are in thy hands. Open them by the power of thy might and thy sovereignty. Potent art thou to do as thou pleasest. Thou art verily the Almighty, the Beneficent. Thank you for sharing this moment of prayer with me. Have a blessed and wonderful day, and be of good cheer.